Let us pray. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our salvation. Amen. You're going to hear it. I'm a little ill. So I've got a sick baby at home. Everyone's coughing and sneezing, and we're all faint. So if I pass out halfway through this, Josh Randall is going to pick me up and sweep me up like a scene out of The Bodyguard and take me to safety. Thank you.
Student nurse.
Sure, exactly. Last week, we looked at the story of Jesus healing a man who'd been blind with spit and mud. And what immediately follows after that in John is a reflection on the nature of vision versus blindness. Now, in John, the miracles of Jesus always reflect a deeper meaning. In this case, the restoration of physical sight is linked to spiritual sight, playing with this double meaning. Jesus suggests to the man who had been blind that there is a link between his humility and his healing, his ability to see. Conversely, to the Pharisees, Jesus says, because you claim to be able to see, you are blind. This is something that gets said over and over again throughout the Bible. The scriptures warn us about knowing too assuredly. They warn us against the dangers of religious authorities, the false certainty of church dogma, and the blindness that comes from a too strict of a letter of the law reading of the law. In 1 Corinthians, Paul reminds us that such knowledge puffs up, but that only love in action builds up. And he says, those who think they know something do not yet know as they really ought to know. So this is our calling as people of faith. This is what we're asked to do. In our service to the world, if it's really to reflect the love and the liberation of the Spirit, we must go beyond blindly looking back and have fresh vision looking forward. If ours is to be a real thing, an actual living, breathing faith, we have to apply that to all the questions that confront us in the real world of our lives. That's our commitment as a church, as a faith community. And so, this last week, we celebrated on Tuesday, I think it was, just Tuesday, the 45th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And that is, in case you don't know and never read anything on the news, this is the Supreme Court decision which said that any laws restricting or criminalizing abortions are unconstitutional. And because since then, the so-called pro-life movement has largely been run and promoted by Christians, I think it deserves our careful consideration. In the past year, Trump, his administration, has systematically chipped away of the laws which protect reproductive rights. And because it's largely happened because of evangelical backing, this is something I think we need to look at. Say nothing of the fact that, did you know, 10 out of the 25 major healthcare providers in this country are run by the Catholic Church. A Catholic Church which presumes that their anti-choice ideology knows better for reproductive health than women or their doctors. So as Christians, it's a difficult subject. No one wants always to talk about it, but it's something we have to look at for what is being done in the name of our faith. So in light of all this, this morning I wanted to share with you a story you might not have ever heard of. It's a story of a very different Christian response to the issue, and this one comes from one of my very own mentors, Reverend Howard Moody. In the 1950s and 60s, Reverend Moody, a younger minister at the time, was confronted by a series of situations where a parishioner who had an unwanted pregnancy was confronted with genuine life or death health risks. And Howard, at the time, a young minister in New York City, didn't know what to do about it, didn't know where to go. Abortion providers were few and far between, and often, if you did get one, it required either a lot of money or privileged connections or some kind of secret underground knowledge. In time, this led both him and other clergy from around the city and state to kind of gather together on this issue, to put their heads together to share resources, but also really pray and discern what are we as Christians called to do about it. Now, years later, after the fact, Reverend Moody and his business manager of the church, it's like the Kara Roth of the church he was at, Arlene Carmans, they wrote a book about all of this. It was called Abortion, Counseling, and Social Change. And what's surprising about that book, if you read it today, years after the fact, is that it's clear, reading it, that it was written before a widespread religious opposition to abortion had become manufactured as a talking point that everyone was going to live or die on. Now, granted, there were religious people at the time who did not like it, but it had a very different place. Howard addresses some of that in the book, but mainly what he's doing is focusing on the immediate practical pastoral and medical realities of women who are in his life and experience throughout the city in clear and immediate life-threatening need for care. And Howard writes, and he told me years later, that it was the immediacy of that dire need on his front door that brought the issue into gospel focus for him. So recognizing that at the time there were thousands of women dying from unsafe abortions in the United States, and that a disproportionate number of those women were poor women of color, Howard and Arlene, the business manager, and others took the lead in developing the now infamous Clergy Consultation service on abortion. Raise your hand if you've heard about it. Okay, just a handful of Baptists in the room somewhere who know what it is. Bridget Dunlap wrote in The Atlantic a few years ago, she said that this was a kind of pre-internet Yelp for illicit abortion providers. When a physician at the time was willing to provide abortions and was recommended to this service, Arlene and other church ladies from Judson Memorial were sent around the country posing as pregnant women to figure out how the office was, how their bedside care was, the actual medical procedure, and of course, the cost. The cost made things as prohibitive for some women as the laws themselves. And they would do this, and eventually they became the trusted and largest referral service in the country, referring an over 500,000 women around the country for abortions in the 6 years of its existence. There's so much more to this story. I can't share it in the confines of one sermon. At one point, the CCS, as it was called, founded a women's health clinic of their own right there in New York City, and it served more abortion patients than all of the other New York City hospitals combined. Imagine if a church did that today, what the political fallout would be. So interesting. Over time, they moved from just direct care and advocacy to community organizing and legislation, and much of the momentum developed by the CCS helped change abortion laws throughout the country. To learn more, you can read Howard's book at some point. It's still out there. There's a few copies out there you can probably get somewhere. But in light of what has happened since 1973, these are theological matters. And especially given the erosion of reproductive rights in the last year, I'd like to read to you some of their initial statement when they founded this clergy consultation service. It's often cited only in social justice histories of this issue. But for regular church folk, this is a document from the 20th century that has largely been overlooked for its theological significance and relevance to us. And because this man did so much for me, I would like to share this statement, part of the statement, with you. Here it is, Howard Moody. The present abortion laws require over 1 million women in the United States each year to seek illegal abortions and often cause severe mental anguish, physical suffering, and the unnecessary death of women. These laws also compel the birth of unwanted, unloved, and often deformed children. Yet we know that a truly humane society must be one in which the birth of a child is an occasion for genuine celebration and not the imposition of a penalty or punishment on the mother. We are deeply distressed that recent attempts to suggest even a conservative change in the law, affecting only extreme cases of rape, incest, and deformity of the child, have been met with such immediate and hostile reaction in some quarters, including the charge that all abortion is murder. But we affirm that there is a period during gestation when, although there may be embryo life in the fetus, there is no living child upon whom the crime of murder can be committed. Therefore, we pledge, as clergy, to a continuing effort to educate and inform the public to the end that a more liberal abortion law in this state and throughout the nation can be enacted. In the meantime, women are being driven alone and afraid into the underworld of criminality, or the dangerous practice of self-induced abortion. Confronted with a difficult decision and the means of implementing it, women today are forced by ignorance, misinformation, and desperation into courses of action that require human concern on the part of each and every religious person. Belief in the sanctity of life certainly demands helpfulness and sympathy to women in trouble and concern for living children, many of whom today are deprived of their mothers who die following self-induced abortions or those performed under substandard medical practices. So we are reminded that there are duly licensed and reputable physicians who in their wisdom perform these abortions presently, which some may regard as illegal. When a doctor performs such an operation, motivated by compassion and concern, we do not regard this as criminal, but as living by the highest standard of the Hippocratic Oath. Therefore, believing as clergy and people of good faith that there are higher laws and moral obligations transcending all legal codes, we believe that it is our pastoral responsibility and our religious duty to give aid and assistance to all women with problem pregnancies. To that end, we are now establishing a clergy consultation service on abortion, which will include referral to the best available medical advice and to aid all women in need. It still moves me to read this, and what a different religious moment we were in at this particular intersection of time. 45 years later, however, we seem to be going backward instead of forward. And this is a story which is still very much in motion. There are so many examples. I'm sure you brought some of your own today. But just to name a few from the past year, in January 2017, immediately after taking office, the Trump administration reinstated something called the Mexico City policy, which cuts aid funding to any international organization that so much as mentions abortion as an option to a pregnant woman. The following April, they cut funding to the UN Population Fund, which provides reproductive health in more than 150 countries. And of course, in October, they curtailed radically the right to birth control here in the US, which had been enshrined by Obamacare. Under the guise of a pro-life platform, there is a thinly veiled anti-woman reality growing again in this country.
Amen.
And we must recognize that in the hate war against immigrants, people of color, and the poor that we talked about last week, women too are being targeted by the white patriarchs. And this is important. who are currently in control of our government, much of our culture and economy, and very oftentimes our churches as well. In the weeks ahead, we'll examine how this also extends to gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, and anyone else who does not match the fragile identity pattern of those who are in control of our society. And even as this happens, under the name of Christianity, under an antiquated reading of the Bible that some would have us believe that they are thus advocating for some inherent plan hardwired into creation, even though that is not what is written anywhere in the scriptures, that this direct, cruel misreading makes it so clear, abundantly clear, that this is not the gospel. It's a lie. And it is, in fact, the exact kind of Pharisaic blindness that Jesus directly warns us about, only from the beginning to the end. Now, I'm not standing here with any authority over anybody. Just ask my family. I have none. I do not call the shots literally anywhere. And it would thus not be right or appropriate or desiring on my part to say whether or not it is ever right to have an abortion in any given set time or place or circumstances. Within my own friends and family, I have many people who stand on radically different sides of this, and I honor their decisions. What to me is unconscionable is the notion that someone else other than the person in question would have the right to make that decision about their own bodies. That's just crazy. Where in the Bible does it ever say anywhere that God grants us the right to remove the sole freedom that our Creator has given absolutely each and every one of us? Because this is not a debate about whether or not abortions are right or wrong. This is a struggle of dominance about who has the power and the authority to control our bodies. Who gets to say, do we trust panels of white older men to legislate us at a great distance, or like Jesus and like God, do we inherently trust people enough to do what is right and live with that inside their own circumstances? Today, so much of what Howard Moody, Arlene Carmans, and so many others, what they fought for is currently being chipped away in our times. And as Christians, I would hope that you would pray and search and discern and join me in a commitment to never having to open up something like the Clergy Consultation service on abortion ever again. I once promised Howard that if it ever came to it, I surely would. But we do not want to go back. We want to go forward. So today, after a song from the choir, which is going to be beautiful, we're going to pray in our hearts, and we're going to welcome up one of our own members, my friend Mcelroy, to talk about the We're Not Going Back campaign that she launched last weekend, and also some ways that all of us as Christian people who believe in our Bible and in the gospel can support a woman's right to choose. Because within the bottom of my heart, I believe that is what we are called to do by God. Because as people and followers of the gospel, we must always be wary of people, authorities, who think that they can see for the rest of us. Again and again and again, Jesus tells us that the root of spiritual blindness is this thought that they know better. That this thought is what Jesus tells us is the antithesis of what he calls the way. So if such knowledge puffs up, and only the love of the way builds up, let us be clear and unafraid about which we choose. Let us be builders of the way. Amen.
Let's go down, down to the water to pray. Down to the water to pray. Down to the water to pray.
When I went down to the water to pray, studying about that good old way, how you supply eternal life, good Lord, show me the way.
Oh, brother, let's go down. Let's go down. Come on down. Oh, brother, let's go down. Down to the water to pray.
When I went down to the water to pray, studying about that good old way that you supply, eternal life, good Lord, show me the way.
Oh, sister, let's go down. Let's go down. Come on down. Oh, sister, let's go down. Down to the water to pray. When I went down to the water to pray, studying about that good old way, how you supply eternal life, good Lord, show me the way. Oh, children, let's go down, come on down. Oh, children, let's go down to the water to pray.
When I went down to the water to pray, studying about that good old way, how you supply eternal life, good Lord, show me the way.
Oh, people, let's go down, come on down. Oh, people, let's go down to the water to pray. Oh, people, let's go down, come on down. Oh, people, let's go down to the water to pray. Down to the water to pray. Sisters, down to the water to pray.
Good morning. I'm Emma. I'm a member here. Welcome to the newbies. You picked heck of a week. I grew up a good Irish Protestant, so the fact that I'm about to say abortion in church is probably not going to be my mother's favorite things I've done this year. Michael's right. Monday was actually the 45th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. 1973, 26-year-old lawyer Sarah Weddington, 26-year-old lawyer Sarah Weddington, successfully argued in front of the Supreme Court. As you might know, I run a business in town called Wildfang. If you don't, wildfang.com, it's great. And so, one of the things we do is we talk a lot about women's rights and women's empowerment. And so I got into this rabbit hole of research a couple of weeks back. You might have guessed, I wasn't born here, okay? So I didn't know a ton about what was happening in 1973 in the US. And so I started to look at the abortion issue here and the Roe v. Wade case in particular, and I discovered a few things that I guess I thought I'd share with you in case maybe you didn't know these things. 1 in 4 women in America between the ages of 18 and 45 will have an abortion. 25%. 7 states in America have 1 clinic left that offers access to abortion care. That's 9 million women in America who are on the brink of losing access to abortion health care. In 2015, 700,000 people in America Googled self-abortion, self-induced abortion, DIY abortion, how to give myself an abortion, home abortion. So let me be real clear, and we can all align on one thing. If you remove access to abortion in those 7 states and beyond, women don't stop having abortions. They just stop having safe, legal abortions. So myself and some of the guys I work with, we thought, how do we impact the issue, right? Now sometimes we're an online retail business, so sometimes we donate a % of profits to an issue or a certain amount of money for every order, and just didn't quite feel enough, we were like, well, what's something really big and ridiculous that we could try to do? Do you think we could keep one of those clinics open for a year? How much money would that take? So we got in touch with one of the clinics, and it cost $750,000 to keep a clinic alive for a year. So we said, why not? Why couldn't Wildfang keep a clinic open for a year? Why couldn't we raise $750,000 to allow millions of women to have access to the health care that they need? Worst thing we can do is fail. So which state? We have 7 to choose from. South Dakota. I don't know if there's anybody from South Dakota, but let me tell you a couple of things about South Dakota. 2015, it received the prestigious award of the worst state in America for women's health and reproductive rights. Some would argue it might be the worst state in America for human rights, but there's no prize for that, so I'm not sure. Additionally, there's only one abortion clinic left in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The entire state government and legislature is in firm opposition to abortion. In 2011, my personal favorite, if you can have one of those, in 2011, the legislature in South Dakota tried to introduce a law, and this is true, so feel free to go home and Google it after the service. In 2011, they introduced a law that essentially allowed anyone who is afraid of an unborn child being harmed or hurt could kill in self-defense. In other words, you would have the right to murder an abortion provider, and you wouldn't face any legal repercussions. Particularly interesting. It didn't pass, but certainly an interesting legislator move. 35% of women who use the Sioux Falls Clinic travel over 300 miles. Some of them, about 10%, travel over 500 miles. So you try doing that as a single mom on public transport in South Dakota, and let me know how that goes for you. South Dakota legislature also introduced a 72-hour waiting period to make sure you're really sure of your decision. So now that 300 to 500 miles that you have to travel on public transport, you get to do it twice within 3 days. And a reminder for all of us that the sexual education program in South Dakota teaches abstinence. So last week, on Monday, so not even a full week, we launched a project called We're Not Going Back. It's on a platform called Indiegogo. It's a fundraising platform. So 6 days we launched it. 6 days ago we launched it, and as of 10/24 today, we'd raised $78,000. So, yeah, $78,000. And a particular thank you to Congresswoman Kristi Noem in South Dakota, who posted a bunch of hateful things on Facebook that really spurred some donations. So, if you're moved to after the service, share it, donate to it. If you're not, that's totally cool. I think the one thing I want to leave you with is, for those of you who don't know me, I'm in a committed same-sex relationship and about to get married, so it's pretty unlikely that I will become unexpectedly pregnant. Unless it's a miracle, I guess. So it's also unlikely I'm ever going to need an abortion. And that's probably true for a lot of people here. And, maybe you wouldn't choose that decision, but at least you would have the right to choose. And as a Christian, I believe that we're called to serve. And that's pretty much the number one thing that we're called to do. And part of that serving is serving women who I've never met in a state that I've never been to because they really need our help. Thank you so much for listening.